The knock came at 6 a.m., sharp and heavy, echoing through the thin walls of Aliyah Cooper's tiny apartment. She was 22 years old, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her head, and she had only been asleep for 3 hours after a grueling double shift. Dragging herself to the door, she expected a heavy-handed landlord or a noise complaint. Instead, she opened it to find 3 United States military officers in full dress uniforms standing in her cramped, dimly lit hallway. The colonel at the front had a face carved from stone. He looked at the exhausted young woman in her faded sweatpants and said, "Miss Cooper, we are about George Fletcher." Aliyah's heart dropped into her stomach. Her voice shook as she gripped the doorframe. "George? The old man from the bus stop? Did something happen to him?" The colonel's expression didn't soften, but his eyes dropped for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we need to talk about what you did for him. To understand why the United States military was standing in a run-down apartment complex on a Tuesday morning, you have to go back 6 months." Aliyah took the number 47 bus every morning at 6:15 a.m. in the freezing pre-dawn dark. And every morning she saw him, George, a 68-year-old homeless man sleeping on a bed of flattened cardboard boxes outside a closed laundromat. Hundreds of people walked past him every single day. Businessmen in suits, college students on their phones, people who treated him like he was invisible. A ghost haunting the sidewalk. For 2 weeks, Aliyah had done the same. She told herself she didn't have enough to help him, and it was true. She barely had enough to survive. Her 300-square-foot apartment was a monument to American poverty. Her kitchen counter was buried in past-due electric bills, medical debt and collections, and deferred student loans. But one freezing morning in March, Aliyah packed an extra peanut butter sandwich for her shift at the hospital cafeteria. Looking at it, she realized it would just go bad before her second shift at the grocery store ended at midnight. When she walked up to the bus stop, George was already awake. His eyes weren't glazed over like she expected. They were sharp, piercing. "Excuse me," Aliyah said, her breath fogging in the cold air as she held out the plastic bag. "I made too much." "You want this?" George stared at the sandwich and then slowly looked up at her. He took in her worn-out coat, the exhaustion under her eyes. "You need that more than I do," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "That's debatable," she replied. "But I'm offering." He took it with both hands, holding the cheap bread and peanut butter like it was made of gold. "Thank you, Miss Aliyah," she said. "George Fletcher," he replied. She almost walked away right then. But there was something about the way he sat, an unshakable dignity wrapped in a filthy coat, that made her stop. "How do you take your coffee?" she asked. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Black's fine." That was the beginning. The next morning she brought black coffee and a banana. By the end of the week it wasn't just a favor. It was a ritual. For 10 minutes every morning before the 47 bus arrived, they were just 2 people. She would tell him about her nursing classes at the community college, the ones she was failing because she was too tired to study. And George? George told her stories. Impossible, crazy stories. "Back in my helicopter days," he'd say, staring off into the morning traffic, "we flew senators to places that don't exist on any map. I worked for a 3-letter agency once." "Can't tell you which one, of course." Aliyah would just smile and nod. She figured his mind was slipping, that he was building himself a grand, fictional past to escape the crushing humiliation of the cardboard beneath him. She never corrected him. She just let him be a hero for 10 minutes a day. But George wasn't just a storyteller. He was observant. One morning, a man in a sharp suit walked by, looked at his phone, and deliberately kicked George's thin blanket into the filthy street gutter. Aliyah saw red. She spun around, dropping her bag. "Hey, what is wrong with you?" The businessman scoffed. "He's blocking the sidewalk. It's a public hazard. That is somebody's grandfather." Aliyah shouted back, her voice echoing down the block as the man hurried away. She knelt down, her hands shaking with anger, and helped George wring the freezing, filthy water out of the fabric. George watched her quietly. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "Yeah, I did." He looked at her for a long time. "You've got a fight in you, Aliyah. That's good. In this world, you're going to need it." By May, that fight was almost gone. Aliyah's life was falling apart. She sat at her kitchen table one night, staring at the math that millions of Americans know all too well. Paycheck, minus rent, minus past-due utilities. She had $90 left to survive the month. She opened her fridge. 3 eggs, half a jug of milk. That was it. Her stomach growled, a hollow ache. But sitting on the counter was a fresh loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. It was enough for another week of sandwiches for George. She stared at it. She could stop. She could keep the food, eat it herself, save the $5 a week on coffee, and slowly dig herself out. But the thought of walking up to that freezing bus stop, looking into George's expectant eyes, and having absolutely nothing to give him, it broke her heart. The next morning, she was at the bus stop at 6:15 a.m. When she handed George the sandwich, he looked at it, then looked at her. Without a word, he carefully tore the sandwich exactly in half and held one piece out to her. "Fair is fair," he whispered. Aliyah had to turn around to watch the traffic, so he wouldn't see the tears spilling down her cheeks. Then, on a Monday in June, George was gone. His cardboard was gone. His blanket was gone. Sidewalk was empty. Aliyah let 3 buses pass her by, standing on the corner in a panic. She checked back that night. Nothing. For a week, she barely slept. She spent her breaks calling homeless shelters, dialing overcrowded city hospitals, asking for an old man with sharp eyes. Nobody had seen him. On the 7th day, she left a note taped to the brick wall of the laundromat. "Hope you're okay." That afternoon, she saw him, but he was a ghost of himself. His face was gray and drawn, his clothes hanging off his frame. Aliyah ran to him, dropping her bag. "George, where were you?" "Had a spell," he rasped. "I'm all right now." But as he reached out, Aliyah saw a fresh scar on his hand. It was surgical, clean, too precise to be a street accident. When she asked about it, he quickly pulled his frayed sleeve down. "Old wound," he muttered. Then his trembling hand reached into his coat. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. "If something happens to me," he said, his voice suddenly commanding, "I need you to mail this. Promise me, Aliyah." She took the envelope. It felt heavy with secrets. "I promise." 2 weeks later, the inevitable happened. George was holding the hot thermos of coffee when his hands began to shake violently. The thermos shattered on the concrete. George's eyes rolled back, his words slurring into nonsense, and his body folded. Aliyah caught him before his head hit the pavement. Screaming for someone to call 911, in the back of the screeching ambulance, the paramedic looked at her. "Are you family?" "I'm all he's got," she lied. At the hospital, the reality of the American healthcare system slammed into them. The intake nurse took one look at George's dirty clothes and lack of ID. "No insurance. We're transferring him to County Overflow. You can't put him in the hallway." Aliyah pleaded. "He's a veteran. Check the VA system." "Do you have proof?" the nurse asked, her tone bored. Aliyah's mind raced. "I'm his niece." "Run his name, please," a doctor walking by overheard. "Just run it as a courtesy," he sighed. The nurse rolled her eyes and typed George Allen Fletcher into the federal database. A second later, the computer chimed. The nurse's bored expression vanished. The color completely drained from her face. There's a match," she stammered. "Honorable discharge 2001, but his service record. It's entirely redacted. It's all blacked out." The doctor stepped behind the desk, his brow furrowing. "What does that mean?" "It means his service was classified," the nurse whispered, looking at Aliyah with wide eyes. "What exactly did your uncle do?" "I don't know," Aliyah said softly. "He didn't talk about it." The doctor immediately straightened his posture. "Transfer him to Ward C private room. I'll personally handle the VA billing. For the next 3 weeks, George lived in a clean, brightly lit VA facility. He had a soft bed, regular hot meals, and nurses who treated him with respect. Aliyah visited him every single day. She took the last of her paycheck, the money meant for her electric bill, and bought him a thick brand-new navy blue blanket. When she laid it over his legs, George's eyes filled with tears. "No one has done this much for me in 20 years, he choked out. "Well," Aliyah smiled, holding his fragile hand. "Somebody should have." George died quietly on a Tuesday in August. His heart simply gave out. When Aliyah arrived at the hospital, they handed her a plastic bag with his belongings. The blue blanket, 3 shirts, and a small sealed envelope addressed to her. Sitting in her cold, dark apartment, Aliyah opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was taken decades ago. A younger, stronger George stood tall in a pristine military uniform, a row of heavy medals pinned to his chest. He was standing with 2 men in expensive suits. Aliyah recognized one of them immediately as sitting United States Senator. She flipped the photo over. Written in shaky handwriting were 3 words, "Remember the girl." Trembling, Aliyah went to her drawer and pulled out the heavy envelope George had told her to mail weeks ago. She looked at the address. The Pentagon. Office of the Inspector General. General Victoria Ashford. Inside was a letter. Aliyah read the copy he had left for her. General Ashford. If you are reading this, I am gone. But I do not want to talk about my service. I want you to know about Aliyah Cooper. For 6 months, she brought me breakfast every morning, not because she had to. She did it because she saw me when the rest of the world looked away. This country took everything I gave it and then lost me in its paperwork. But this young girl, struggling, exhausted, and broke, gave me dignity when I had absolutely nothing. She deserves better than what this country gave me. Remember her like she remembered me, greater than George Fletcher. GS to 14 Intelligence, retired. He hadn't been crazy. The stories about the helicopters, the classified missions, the senators, every single word of it was true. Aliyah mailed the letter the next morning, dropping it into a blue metal box, watching it disappear. She thought it was over. She thought no one in power would ever care about a dead homeless man or a broke college student. She went back to work. Back to the double shifts. Back to surviving. Until the morning in September when the military knocked on her door. Within 48 hours, Aliyah was on an airplane for the first time in her life. She was flown to Washington, D.C., escorted through the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, and brought into an office overlooking the Potomac River. Sitting behind the desk was General Victoria Ashford, a woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and 4 stars on her shoulders. "Miss Cooper," the general said, opening a thick manila folder. "I received George's letter 3 weeks ago. It was the first proof we had in 15 years that he was even alive. And then it was proof that he had died." "I just brought him coffee," Aliyah whispered, intimidated by the room. "You did more than that," Ashford corrected her gently. George Fletcher was one of the greatest intelligence operatives this nation ever produced. He ran highly classified missions in Desert Storm and Kosovo. He saved lives. When he retired, he should have been taken care of for the rest of his life. Instead, severe PTSD and a bureaucratic error erased him from our system. By the time we realized our mistake, he had disappeared into the streets. We failed him. Completely. Ashford leaned forward. His letter wasn't asking for medals. It was asking for us to recognize you. And I want you to testify before the United States Senate about exactly what happened. Aliyah froze. Me? Why would the Senate listen to a broke nurse's aide? Because, the general said, you are the only person in this story who did the right thing simply because it needed doing. On October 12th, Aliyah walked into a massive committee room. The flashing of press cameras blinded her. Powerful politicians looked down from their elevated wooden desks. Before the hearing began, political aides had pulled her aside. They told her to stick to the script. They told her to tone down the part about her own poverty, to make it just a heartwarming story about a veteran. When the microphone clicked on, Aliyah looked at her prepared notes. And then she pushed them away. "I met George in March," her voice rang out, echoing off the marble walls. "He slept on cardboard at my bus stop. I brought him a peanut butter sandwich. He told me stories about helicopters and top-secret missions, and I thought he was losing his mind, but I brought him breakfast anyway. Because it didn't matter if his stories were true. He was still a human being." She looked directly up at the senators. "I did it for 6 months. Because no one else did. And because he mattered even if the world decided to forget him." A senator leaned into his microphone, his tone defensive and skeptical. "Miss Cooper, the VA budget is strained. Are you suggesting that American taxpayers fund high-level care for every homeless person on the street?" The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Aliyah didn't blink. She leaned into her mic. "I'm not talking about every homeless person. I am talking about George Fletcher. A man who flew your colleagues to safety. A man who risked his life in the dark so you could sleep in the light. You made him a promise when you sent him into danger. I kept my promise with the $2 sandwich. You broke yours with paperwork that buried him alive." Gasps rippled through the press gallery. "If we only care about people when we discover they have medals and files," Aliyah continued, her voice trembling with righteous fury, "we have already lost our souls." George wasn't a hero because of his military record. He was a hero because, even when his country abandoned him to sleep on the concrete, he woke up every single morning with dignity. He deserved better. And if you meet a 22-year-old girl working 2 jobs to prove to you that veterans are worth caring about, then I don't know what I am doing in this room. She sat back. The silence in the chamber was deafening. General Ashford stood up from the gallery. Effective immediately, she announced over the stunned silence. The Department of Defense is allocating $5 million to establish the George Fletcher Memorial Task Force to locate lost veterans. And I am personally appointing Miss Aliyah Cooper as its community liaison. Reporters swarmed Aliyah as she left the Capitol. They asked her how it felt to be famous, to go viral. Aliyah just looked at the cameras and said, "I don't want to be famous. I just want George to be remembered." 6 months later, Aliyah Cooper walked through the pristine green lawns of Arlington National Cemetery. She wasn't broke anymore. She managed the task force, helping over 2,000 forgotten veterans get their benefits back. She walked up to a stark white marble headstone. George Allen Fletcher. Intelligence officer, U.S. Army. Aliyah knelt in the grass. From her bag, she pulled out a plastic sandwich bag containing a peanut butter sandwich, and gently rested it on top of the cold marble. "I kept my promise, George," she whispered. The next morning, Aliyah stood at the exact same freezing bus stop in her city. Standing next to her was a 16-year-old girl from a local mentorship program. As a homeless man shuffled down the sidewalk, shivering in the dawn air, Aliyah handed the teenager a bag with a sandwich, a banana, and a water bottle. "Why are we doing this?" the teenager asked. Aliyah smiled, watching the sun rise over the city. "Because an old friend taught me something a long time ago. Small things aren't small. Kindness doesn't need an audience. And fairness doesn't need permission." As the number 47 bus pulled up, Aliyah looked back at the empty patch of sidewalk where George used to sleep. Just for a second, in the corner of her eye, she swore she saw him sitting there, holding a cup of black coffee and smiling. Then he was gone, but the fight he saw in her? That would live forever.